The brain, the center of our bodily control, and the site of all unconscious and conscious bodily actions. Hi, today's lesson is on the central nervous system. So the central nervous system is divided into two parts, and one of those parts is the spinal cord. The spinal cord has gray matter in the center and white matter on the outside. And the spinal cord connects the peripheral nervous system to the brain. So the nervous system in our limbs, legs, and muscles to our brain. The spinal cord receives sensory information through the dorsal root, which is the back of the spinal cord, and it transfers that information through the ventral root at the front of the cord, so more near our abdomen. Those sensory nerves enter the spinal column, have their own cell bodies localized in a mass outside the spinal cord known as a ganglion. So our basic nervous pathway. So pairs of nerve bundles exit at each vertebra, one for each side of the body. At rear are the sensory nerves, and forward are the motor nerves. So at the front of the spinal cord are the nerves that are going to affect muscle action, and at the rear of the spinal cord are the nerves that carry sensory information to the spinal cord. So the cell bodies of motor neurons in the spinal cord are multipolar, and the spinal cord and brain are covered by membranes called meninges, which prevent the exposure of the brain and the spinal cord to bone and any other bacteria or any other hazard. And there's a fluid called the cerebral spinal fluid, which bathes the spinal cord and brain, which acts as a shock absorber and transport nutrients and wastes to and from the brain and spinal cord. The brain also has spaces in it known as fissures, which are filled also with cerebral spinal fluid. The second part of the central nervous system is the brain, which is made up of three main sections. We have the hindbrain, which consists of the cerebellum, the medulla oblongata, and the pons. So the cerebellum is responsible for limb movement, balance, and coordination. The medulla oblongata lies just above the spinal cord. It's kind of almost an enlargement of the spinal cord, and it controls breathing, digestion, peristalsis, heart rate, blood pressure, and lots of other autonomic bodily functions. And then the pons is the bridge between the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata. So when we look at the brain, we look at the hindbrain, which includes the pons, the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata. So the pons is this kind of round enlargement at the top of the spinal cord. The cerebellum is at the base of the brain. It almost kind of looks like a cauliflower. And the medulla oblongata is just an enlargement of the spinal cord at the base of the brain, which controls all of our autonomic functions. So our medulla oblongata is responsible for controlling autonomic system activities like the stimulation of the diaphragm, breathing, heartbeat, blood pressure, sneezing, coughing, vomiting. And it also provides a pathway for impulses moving from higher parts of the brain to motor nerves and muscles. The cerebellum is located just above the medulla at the back of the head. It is gray and white matter and has a very furrowed appearance, like I said, kind of like cauliflower, and it's responsible for coordination of muscle movement and balance and muscle tone. Generally, if you have damage to your cerebellum or if you have an injury to your cerebellum, you might seem really clumsy and unorganized. You're not able to walk straight. So very, very noticeable change in your behavior. And then the last part of the hindbrain is the pons. And the pons bridges between the medulla and the midbrain, and it also will allow for transmission between both sides of the cerebellum. So the midbrain forms part of the brain stem, and it acts as a relay center between the hindbrain and the forebrain. It's located just above the pons, and it's the relay center for some of the eye and ear reflexes. It also contains a network of neurons known as the reticular formation that activate the forebrain. And it allows us to concentrate on some specific stimuli while ignore the rest. The forebrain consists of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the cerebrum. So the thalamus is a sensory relay center that directs incoming sensory signals. It has a lot to do with our sleep and wakefulness cycle, as well as the sensations of temperature and pain sensation as well. So we have our thalamus at the front of our brain, the hypothalamus right in the center, and then the cerebrum is that large over top part that we think of when we see a brain with all those fissures and wrinkles in it. So the thalamus is located between the midbrain and the cerebrum. Like we said, it's a sensory relay impulse station, and it affects consciousness and awareness of pain. Hypothalamus connects to a special structure known as the pituitary gland, and this is where our nervous and endocrine system are intertwined. The hypothalamus is able to control blood pressure, urine production, water balance, hunger, body temperature, our internal organs, as well as our autonomic nervous system. And it can also affect behavioral and emotional responses. The hypothalamus connects to and controls the pituitary gland, which is dangling right there. Controls the autonomic nervous system. So, again, these are things that happen in our body to maintain homeostasis that we don't have to think about. And it controls basic drives such as hunger, thirst, sex, and rage. The pituitary gland, which this arrow is pointing to, produces and then stores the hormones, and it releases them generally at the direction of the hypothalamus. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the human brain. It's about 80% of our brain mass. And the cerebral cortex surrounds the cerebrum and it's composed of the gray matter. And the inside of the cerebrum is composed of white matter. So then again, these will be myelinated neurons. The cerebrum is folded with lots of wrinkles in it, which increases its surface area, and it's divided into two cerebral hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Now, the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So when we're looking at our cerebrum, this is the upper and outermost and the largest part of the human brain, and it's our highest center of nervous control. So this is what we control, what we're mostly aware of. Now, there's a story of a gentleman called Phineas Gage, and he had improvised cerebral surgery. So he was working on a railway. There was an explosion, and he took a pipe right through the front of the head. And like miraculously, he survived. However, he had some very noticeable behavioral changes where he used to be a fun and easygoing guy. He was then quick to anger and had other negative personality changes because of his traumatic injury. So the corpus callosum is a bundle of nerve fibers that connects the left and right hemisphere. And then those hemispheres can be further divided into four different lobes: the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital. So our brain surface is covered with a whole bunch of fissures. This allows for more surface area and more synapses, which allows for more thinking. And we can see here that the brain, two main fissures in the brain separated into regions. So we have the left and right, as well as we have a front and back. We have longitudinal fissures that separate the brain into a left and right hemisphere that are connected with the corpus callosum, which is made up of white matter, which would be myelinated neurons. And the hemispheres seem responsible for different tasks. And again, this is just in general, but nothing super set in stone. So the right brain is responsible for our facial features, our spatial sense, artistic, creative, and intuitive processes, where the left brain is typically responsible for our speech areas, our verbal control, our mathematical thinking, as well as rational and logical thinking. Now, again, this is just general because if somebody had part of their corpus callosum severed to deal with epilepsy when they were quite young, and those two sides can't talk, they're still able to function completely normally because the brain is very plastic and is able to recruit new neurons in a different area to maintain functions that might not have been able to communicate due to that surgery. So when we look at the lobes of the brain, we have the frontal lobe, which is at the front of the cerebrum and controls the voluntary muscles. So it's at the front of the brain. It controls our walking, our speech, and our intelligence. The temporal lobe will be located at the temples, and this controls part of vision as well as hearing and memory and interpreting sensory information such as smell. The parietal lobe is located at the top and the back of the cerebrum. And I typically remember this one because parietal starts with a P, so it is ponytail. So your parietal lobe is where you would put a ponytail on your head. And this is responsible for senses such as touch and temperature, emotion, and interpreting speech and pressure. And then the last lobe is known as the occipital lobe, and it's at the lower back of the cerebrum and interprets visible information. So here's a diagram of the different lobes. We have our frontal lobe, responsible for executive functioning, thinking, planning, organizing. Our motor cortex, which is responsible for movement. Our sensory cortex, which is responsible for sensations. Our temporal lobe with memory, understanding, and language. Our parietal lobe for perception. And our occipital lobe at the back for vision. So again, our frontal lobe is highly developed in humans and controls our personality and voluntary movements because it contains the motor cortex. So this is where we are able to um, consider our actions. It also is the site for sorting sensory information. Our parietal lobe, where you would put kind of a ponytail, is responsible for the sensory receptors of the skin and our body detection awareness. The temporal lobe is responsible for hearing and smell, and the occipital lobe is for vision. And again, I can remember the occipital lobe is for vision because it's as far away from the eyes as you can get, where the temporal lobe is quite close for hearing and smell. When we look at the sensory and motor regions of the cortex, our motor cortex controls all the voluntary motor activities like I'm going to run over there, I'm going to pick up a ball, I'm going to put this fork into my mouth. And it's generally the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body and vice versa. So now our brain is enclosed in a skull to protect it, but it's also surrounded by cerebrospinal fluid, which bathes the brain in liquid, allowing for water to um, be transferred to the cells as well as anything else that it might need because there aren't blood vessels in um, around our brain necessarily. So, like the spinal cord, it is also surrounded by meninges, which hold that cerebrospinal fluid in place. Now, meningitis is an infection or inflammation of the meninges, and it can be caused by bacteria or a virus, and it's very serious um, and needs to be tested with a spinal tap. So, this is when they draw some fluid out of your cerebrospinal fluid from near your spine and look for infection or causes of infection. So the last part of the brain that I want to discuss is the PNS and the ANS, or the peripheral nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is made up of somatic and autonomic nerves, which extend beyond the brain and spinal cord. And so this goes into the rest of our body, our muscles, our limbs, our organs. And then the autonomic nervous system controls the internal organs and is made up of two involuntary systems. So our nervous system up there in red is separated into the central nervous system, which is made up only of the brain and spinal cord. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is made up into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is made up of sensory neurons as well as motor neurons, which detect information and cause effects in our body. And then the autonomic nervous system contains the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So our somatic nerves allow us to have voluntary control of our skeletal muscles, our bones, and our skin through our muscle movements. And our motor nerves carry messages from the central nervous system to the effectors. So our somatic nerves from the skeletal bones, muscles, and skin go back to our central nervous system. And our motor nerves carry messages from the central nervous system to the effectors, our glands or muscles. And we have our autonomic nervous system, which controls our involuntary bodily actions. We have our sympathetic division, which preps the body for emergencies, our fight or flight response. So this would be an increased heart rate, an increased breathing rate, the movement of blood from the skin to the muscles, the halt in digestion. And then the parasympathetic nervous system would return our body to normal after a time of immediate stress. So it will start digestion again. It will allow our pupils to constrict. It will move blood evenly between the muscles and the skin, not preferencing the muscles for blood flow. as well as returning our heart rate and our breathing rate to normal. So the sympathetic nervous system is generally stimulatory. It prepares our body for fight or flight. And this is caused by the adrenal medulla secreting adrenaline, which causes, like I said, an increased heart and breathing rate, pupil dilation, and a decrease in saliva so we can take in more light and information. The release of glucose so that our muscles can have more energy to contract, a decrease in digestion, and a relaxation of the sphincters in our bodies, as well as an increase in sweat production. So you might also look white as a ghost because the blood, like I said, is moving from your muscles, from your skin to your muscles. And then after a time of short-term stress, like, oh no, that deer popped out in front of me on the road when I was driving, and all of a sudden your heart starts to race and you feel hot and sweaty, is the parasympathetic nervous system, which is generally inhibitory. So it tries to maintain or restore homeostasis after a stressful event. So it will slow our heart rate and breathing rate. It will stimulate peristalsis. So again, this is the movement of food through our digestive system. It will constrict our pupils, contract any sphincters in our body that were relaxed, as well as in general relax our body. So thanks for staying with me to learn all about the brain and its functions. I'll catch up with you guys next time. Bye.